If you have a Bible and find it helpful to follow along in the reading, please turn in it to Luke chapter 24. This is where we will spend our time. Luke chapter 24. Christianity, in terms of its uniqueness, and it is unique in all the world, in terms of all the world religious structures, there are many of them that hold lots of similarities. Christianity is unique in several distinctions, but two of them, at least for me, make it unique in one way that makes it very robust. That is the fact that Christianity is rooted in history. It's not something that somebody just showed up and said some things and we're supposed to just believe those things. Christianity is rooted in history. That makes it robust because history is testable by normal historical means. We say Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Well, we can check that out by normal historical means. But on the other hand, Christianity is also very, very fragile in one specific respect, and that's the respect that brings us here today, which is the fact that Jesus, the claim is he came from the tomb alive. And that's a tiny thread to hang the entirety of Christianity upon. So let's take a look at this text and see what Luke would tell us. Luke chapter 24, I'll begin reading in verse 1. On the first day of the week at dawn, the women went to the tomb, taking the aromatic spices that they had prepared. They found that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men stood beside them in dazzling attire. The women were terribly frightened and they bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's been raised. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then the women remembered Jesus' words. When they returned from the tomb, they told all of these things to the 11 and to the rest. So Luke has given us, most of the Bible, over half, is narrative. That is, it's telling us a story about events that occurred, Old Testament and New. And Luke is narrating an event here. This is an event that, as far as Luke is concerned, is an event in history. This is not something that Luke was told that he just was to imagine this happening. This wasn't something that one person told Luke. This was something that many people had an experience of, and Luke is recounting that experience to us. The Old Testament is the same. If you go back, you read about the wandering in the desert, you read about Joshua's battles, you read all kinds of things where there's a narration of events that are rooted in history. That's very different, very different. If you read the Quran is just a list of sayings from start to finish. It declares all kinds of things, but there's nothing there that explains how these things occurred in time. Whereas in the Old and the New Testaments, that's how it is given. And we can check some of those things out. So the Bible then takes and makes this narrative of this event the linchpin of the entirety of Christianity. Being rooted in history, though, is, while robust, also tenuous because history is gone. I mean, I just said history is gone. That's gone. I mean, it's on the camera, but it's gone. The fact of everything we did prior to this very second is in the past now. And the further that goes back, the more difficult it is for us to pull it back in to a sense of reality that we can say that really happened. The further we go back, the more difficult that is. I've said this before, and this is still my understanding in my own thinking. God could have probably done this in a different way. Well, in fact, certainly he could. I would have, if somebody were to say, "Rip, what would be better?" I would say it would be better if there was something that everybody throughout all time could look at and fix upon and say, now we can see that God has done this in history. We can believe it. We don't have to question it any longer. We don't have to rely upon historical verification for any of it. But the history that we do have is not at all shaky. It's very dependable. It's very well grounded. Just take what I mentioned early on where I said Caesar crossed the Rubicon. How do we know that? I mean, it's in history books, right? Caesar crossed the Rubicon and by doing so declared himself to be in war against the Republic of Rome and turned it into an empire subsequent to that. We know that history, but how do we know it? Were you there? Are there pictures? There's no video. So it's way into history. The only way we can verify things like that is to take facts from around it and say these facts we can see are very well verified. Therefore, from that we can say the declaration that Caesar crossed the Rubicon is also verified because it's every bit as verified as these facts. That's exactly the same procedure that we look at when we say Jesus rose from the dead. So what I want to do today is take just a few minutes, it's not very long, and look at 13 facts that we have from history, all of which these facts are not just facts right out of the Bible. They are from the Bible, but they are facts that all historians of the ancient world will say, yes, these things happened. That's really important. And these facts surround the claim Jesus rose from the grave. So think about these as we go through them today. The first is, no historian of repute in the ancient historical discipline disputes this, that Jesus was crucified in the first century in Rome by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. By the Roman Empire, by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. Jesus was crucified. Nobody disputes that. Nobody. He died by being crucified. The batting average for crucifixions in the Roman Empire was 1,000. They didn't make any mistakes, and if you didn't die right away, they would help you. So nobody came down from a cross and walked off. The second fact, he was buried. That's a fact of history. Jesus was put into a tomb. Why? Well, if you understand anything about Judaism, you can't leave a person's body hanging overnight. And especially that night, it was Passover Eve. So Jesus had to be taken down and put into a tomb somewhere. And it was a known tomb in Jerusalem. How do we know that? Because the women went to it with the spices, as we just read. They had to know where it was. Number 3, Jesus' death, and this one's really important. Jesus' death caused the disciples to lose all hope that he was the Messiah. In this same chapter, if you continue reading, you see Clopas and his wife leaving Jerusalem on their way back to Emmaus. Why are they doing that? The text says it. We thought he was going to be the deliverer of Israel. What's the implication? He got himself crucified. We were wrong. It's over. We're going home. Peter and his gang go back to fishing. The text tells you they went back and went fishing. It's over. This guy that we thought was the Messiah, he's been crucified as a criminal, the worst of criminals. We're just going to go back to what we were doing. Number 4, Jesus' tomb was found empty a few days later. All of the New Testament testifies to this. Paul testifies to it. Peter testifies to it in the speeches that he gives on the temple steps. Number 5, the disciples then later had experiences of seeing Jesus alive after his crucifixion. Now, I state that very carefully. I didn't say Jesus was alive after his crucifixion because a historian will say, no, that's not right. I don't believe in resurrection. But they will say Jesus' disciples had experiences of Jesus alive after the resurrection. However that happened, those experiences did happen, and a historian will say yes to that. Number 6, the disciples were only 40 days later taken from hiding, being brokenhearted, going back home to Emmaus, going back to their fishing, to becoming those who would proclaim the very thing that got Jesus crucified to start with. And they did it in Jerusalem. They didn't do it in some far-flung part of the empire. They went right back to the city where Jesus was crucified in front of the same people that had him crucified for the reasons that they said he should be crucified, and they testified to the same thing. Right in front of all those people. What explains that? That you would be brokenhearted and despondent because your Messiah got himself crucified, which makes him not the Messiah, and now you're going to stand on the very temple steps representing the people who crucified him, and you're going to say, he's alive. What explains that? Number 7, the message of the resurrection is the only message the early church has. There is no competing narrative. There's nothing you can find in the New Testament anywhere that explains this in any other way. Jesus was alive. That was the claim. That is the New Testament claim. Number 8, the early proclamation of the message took place in Jerusalem, where they crucified him. It's not like they went to some secret place and started talking about this. They stood right there on the temple steps in front of all the Jewish leaders, in front of all the Jewish people gathered, 3,000 one day, 5,000 another day, and proclaimed Jesus alive from the grave. And then what do we see? Within months, the church exploding, people becoming Christians, thousands of them, very quickly. Not something that happened over decades, something that happened very quickly. As a matter of fact, by the time of the early 2nd century, the Roman historian Tacitus says it has spread all over the empire in the Mediterranean. Within what? 50 years, 60 years. Number 9, the church grew rapidly and people joined. You saw people just flocking. I mean, Peter spoke to 3,000 who became born again. 3,000 souls were added. Then he speaks again and 5,000 souls were added. Then you have this, number 10, James, the brother of Jesus, becomes a believer. Now what caused James to become a believer? James thought Jesus was crazy. Go back and read the Gospels. His family tried to seize Jesus when he was declaring himself to be who he was. They thought something was wrong with him. They were afraid for him. They knew that this was going to get him in trouble. James didn't believe. What would cause James, his brother, to suddenly become one of the pillars of the church? Paul, Saul of Tarsus, he's persecuting, he's having Christians imprisoned and killed. What would change his mind from that? What would cause him to lay down a career as a Pharisee, a career as the Jew of Jews, and to suddenly become not just an apostle of the resurrection, but an apostle to the Gentiles of the resurrection? Paul, if you were Jewish, went to the pigs to proclaim the very thing that he was trying to stamp out. How do you explain that? Another fact that no historian will deny. Number 12, the Passover. Jesus was put to death on Passover's Eve, and yet he sat with his disciples, as we will celebrate in a little bit, and he took the bread and broke it and said, "This is my body." He took the cup and said, "This is my blood." He said, "From now on, when you do this, don't remember Moses, remember me." The biggest single Jewish festival that there is now is focused on Jesus, not on Moses and the Exodus. That's a big deal. And then number 13, Sunday becomes the Sabbath. Sunday becomes the Sabbath. Saturday was the Sabbath in Judaism. Now, what are we to make of this list, which to me, if I looked at it just historically, I would say it's a formidable list. It's hard to imagine that somebody who of honest temperament would look at a list like this and just walk off from it, but they do. They do. People see this list of facts, they recognize the history, they recognize the truth of the history that surrounds the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, and they say, "Can't believe it. I can't believe it." Why is that? The reason for that is it's not an intellectual problem with the history. It's a moral problem within themselves. It's hard to get people to admit that, but that's the truth. You see, Jesus paid a price. He went to the cross for a reason. He didn't just go to the cross because that's the way the history worked out. He went to the cross to pay for the sins that you and I have committed in our lifetime. That's not a pleasant message for anybody who thinks themselves to be a nice person. So there's not an intellectual problem, but a human problem. And we have the moral problem of what I would call human hubris. We like to think ourselves nice, and we don't want to surrender to God on His terms. We want to come to Him on our own. That's to go all the way back to the garden. We want to know about good and evil, but we want to know about it on our terms, not yours. In other words, we want you to give us the garden on our terms. And we're still dealing with that today. The Bible says in Romans chapter 8, Paul says, the mind of the flesh is death. Kind of harsh. The mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The sinful mind is hostile, or in some translations, at war with God. Does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. That's very significant. It's saying that because of who we are, we can't even submit to the Lord, except that the Lord change us in some way. So what does all this mean for Easter? It tells me that there's a barrier that exists, that a human being cannot cross by themselves. Just can't do it. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says the things of the Spirit are foolishness. So if we talk to somebody about all these facts of history, and we list them off in a very convincing fashion, a person can walk away because Jesus coming out of the tomb alive is foolishness unless the Spirit of God opens somebody up to that as also being a fact. 13 facts are great, but they're not going to convince anybody if they're not willing to be convinced. In other words, if they don't want God, 413 facts are not going to convince them that they need to surrender to Him. So then what does Easter mean to us? It should mean that every day we wake up is Easter. That's what it should mean. But I'm just like everybody else in this room. I am. I worry about the same things everybody else in this room worries about. I allow life's circumstances to defeat me day in and day out, even though I believe Jesus came out of the tomb alive. I remember reading about the play from Eugene O'Neill called Lazarus Laughs. You may have never heard of it. In that play, the Romans capture Lazarus after Jesus has raised him from the dead. And they threaten him. If you don't do what we say, we're going to kill you. And Lazarus laughs at them. Why? He's been there and done that. He already knows what's going on. How are you going to threaten somebody with death when death has been removed, had its meaning removed? But I, like everybody, allow life circumstances to defeat me. We indulge sin. We do. All of us. We indulge things that we know that God would be displeased in our indulging. And this one is the one that stings me the most anyway. We do not exhibit the newness of life that the resurrection should bring to us. I wish I did better at that. So, what are we going to do? Well, my purpose on Resurrection Sunday is not to spank anybody. My purpose is to say, would we resolve on this Resurrection Sunday, 2022, that we'd come to God and say, and really mean it. I think it's a kind of a scary thing to say to God, if you really mean it. To say to Him, not my will, but your will. Not my will, but yours. It's a little scary to say it, I think, if we mean it. But what's the alternative? What's the alternative? I don't want to live this life on my own. Can you bring that from the refrigerator, please?